Blood pooled beneath the collapsed stranger as Marcus froze. The memories flooded back, his medic training, his wife's death, his promise. Around him, hospital staff scrambled uselessly while his son waited at school. In that heartbeat, "Single Dad Janitor Stopped a Code Blue" became more than a headline. It became his resurrection. His hands moved instinctively toward the chest of a dying man. The fluorescent lights of Manhattan Memorial Hospital buzzed overhead as Marcus Evans pushed his mop across the polished floor, the familiar scent of disinfectant filling his nostrils. 7 years had passed since he'd traded surgical scissors for a janitor's cart, a decision made in the fog of grief after losing Sarah. The hospital corridors felt both familiar and foreign to him, a constant reminder of the life he once lived and the one he'd chosen for Tyler's sake. The rhythmic squeak of his wheels against the floor had become a strange comfort, a predictable constant in a life that had once been defined by the chaotic urgency of trauma medicine in combat zones. Through the large windows of the pediatric ward, Marcus could see the city skyline transforming as afternoon surrendered to evening, the same view he'd watched 1,000 times but rarely truly saw anymore. His reflection in the glass showed a man of 42 with prematurely silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that carried the weight of experiences most of the medical staff rushing past him could never understand. He checked his watch. 2 more hours until his shift ended and he could pick up Tyler from his after-school program. His son had a science presentation tomorrow, and Marcus had promised to help him practice tonight. One of the small joys that made his career sacrifice worthwhile. The doctors and nurses moved around him as if he were invisible, their white coats and scrubs creating a stark contrast to his grey maintenance uniform. Dr. Patel nodded briefly as he passed, one of the few who acknowledged the cleaning staff as actual people rather than part of the hospital infrastructure. Marcus returned the gesture with a small smile, appreciating the momentary recognition while simultaneously relieved to remain unnoticed. His anonymity was deliberate, a shield that protected him from questions about his past, questions that would inevitably lead to explanations he wasn't prepared to give about why a former combat medic with exceptional skills was now cleaning up bodily fluids from hospital floors. Marcus turned his cart toward the cardiac wing, listening absently to the symphony of beeping monitors and hushed conversations that filtered through partially closed doors. 7 years of this routine had taught him the rhythms of the hospital better than any orientation could. Which doctors stayed late with patients, which nurses took extra time to comfort families, which administrators cut corners when they thought no one was watching. He knew this place intimately, though few within it knew anything about him. The information asymmetry created a one-way mirror through which he observed hospital life without truly participating in it. The weight of his cell phone in his pocket was a constant reminder of his responsibility to Tyler, now 12, and beginning to ask more complicated questions about his father's choices. "Why are you just a janitor, Dad?" The question had pierced him like shrapnel last week, though he'd maintained his composure as he explained about flexible hours and steady income. He hadn't mentioned how he sometimes caught himself automatically assessing patients in the hallways, diagnosing conditions based on subtle signs most wouldn't notice, or how his fingers sometimes twitched with muscle memory when he overheard trauma cases being discussed. Some truths were better left unspoken, buried beneath the practical necessities of raising a child alone in an unforgiving city. As Marcus rounded the corner near the nurse's station, wiping down the handrails as he went, a commotion erupted ahead of him, raised voices, quickened footsteps, and then the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. His head snapped up to see an elderly man collapsed in the hallway, a visiting family member based on the visitor's badge clipped to his sweater. The man's companion was screaming for help as a young nurse froze in apparent panic, her eyes wide with the terror of unexpected crisis. Marcus felt his world slow down as his body remembered what his mind had been trying to forget, that in another life this moment had been his purpose, his calling. Before conscious thought could intervene, he was already moving forward, leaving his mop and cart forgotten behind him. The elderly man lay motionless on the polished hospital floor, his skin ashen against the sterile white backdrop of the corridor as a small crowd of stunned visitors and one paralyzed nurse hovered uselessly nearby. Marcus felt a familiar clarity wash over him as he dropped to his knees beside the fallen stranger, his janitor's uniform forgotten as his hands moved with practiced precision to check for a pulse at the carotid artery. Nothing. No flutter of life beneath his fingertips, just the rapidly cooling skin of a man whose heart had betrayed him without warning. The visitor's badge read Samuel Wilson, a name that would have meant nothing to Marcus moments ago, but now belonged to someone whose life literally lay in his hands. "Call a code blue and get a crash cart here now," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. The young nurse blinked at him in confusion, clearly trying to reconcile the orders coming from a man in maintenance grey rather than medical white. Time stretched dangerously thin as Marcus positioned himself properly, interlocked his fingers, and began chest compressions with the exact pressure and rhythm ingrained through years of battlefield medicine and countless resuscitations. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, he murmured to himself, the mantra returning as naturally as if he'd never stopped saying it. Each downward press on Samuel Wilson's chest was a negotiation with death, a forceful argument against the inevitable that Marcus had conducted too many times in dusty field hospitals and blood-soaked medical tents. The crowd around him blurred into insignificance as he counted aloud, monitoring the man's coloring, adjusting his technique with the expertise of someone who understood the mechanics of survival at their most fundamental level. With each compression, memories surfaced unbidden. Sarah's face when he'd tried to resuscitate her after the car accident, the futility of his efforts, then, despite all his training, the promise he'd made at her funeral to give Tyler stability above all else. A doctor Marcus recognized as Dr. Patricia Chen rushed toward them with a crash cart, her face registering momentary shock as she processed the scene, a janitor performing textbook CPR with professional composure. "How long has he been down?" she asked, reaching for the defibrillator pads. "About 90 seconds since I started compressions," Marcus responded without breaking rhythm, his tone matching her clinical detachment. No pulse, no respiration, possible cardiac arrest, based on the clutching gesture witnesses described before he fell. The information flowed from him with medical precision, betraying expertise that no maintenance worker should possess. The next moments unfolded in the choreographed efficiency of emergency medicine, Marcus seamlessly integrating into the resuscitation team as if he'd never left the field. He anticipated Dr. Chen's needs before she voiced them, adjusted his position to allow access for the AED, delivered breaths with perfect timing, and continuously monitored vital signs with expert assessment. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, hospital staff pausing in their duties to witness the incongruous scene of a janitor working alongside a senior cardiologist as an equal rather than a subordinate, their movements synchronized in the rhythm of life-saving intervention. "Clear!" Dr. Chen called as the defibrillator charged and Marcus pulled back with practiced efficiency, his eyes never leaving Samuel Wilson's face as the electric current surged through the man's body. A heartbeat of silence followed. Then the monitor beeped, once, twice, establishing an irregular but present rhythm as color gradually returned to the elderly man's cheeks. "We have a pulse," Marcus announced, reaching again for the carotid artery to confirm what the machine displayed. "Respirations returning, but shallow." His assessment was immediate and accurate, spoken with the confidence of thousands of similar evaluations performed under far worse conditions. As the emergency response team arrived to transfer Samuel Wilson to the cardiac unit, Marcus began to step back, the momentary rupture in his carefully constructed identity suddenly closing as reality reasserted itself. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis began to ebb, leaving in its wake an acute awareness of the dozens of eyes now fixed upon him, with expressions ranging from confusion to outright suspicion. Dr. Patricia Chen's gaze was the most penetrating of all, her analytical mind visibly reassessing everything she thought she knew about the quiet janitor who had just demonstrated skills that rivaled her most experienced cardiac nurses. As Samuel Wilson was wheeled away toward treatment, Marcus stood frozen in the aftermath of his instinctive decision, knowing that the invisible walls he had built around his past had just crumbled irrevocably. "Who are you?" Dr. Patricia Chen's voice cut through the silence of the small consultation room, where she had practically dragged Marcus after Samuel Wilson had been stabilized and transferred to the cardiac intensive care unit. The door closed behind them, with a soft click that somehow sounded final to Marcus's ears, the end of his carefully maintained anonymity. The room, designed for difficult conversations with patients and their families, now served as an interrogation chamber of sorts, its soft lighting and comfortable chairs at odds with the intensity radiating from the cardiologist as she stood with arms crossed, waiting for answers that Marcus was reluctant to give. Marcus ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, suddenly acutely aware of the grey janitor's uniform that had been his disguise for 7 years, its fabric now feeling like an ill-fitting costume rather than the shield it had always been. "I'm just the guy who cleans the floors, Dr. Chen," he replied, aiming for casual dismissal but hearing the hollowness in his own words. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second marking the distance between the lie he was telling and the truth that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Outside the frosted glass windows of the consultation room, hospital life continued its endless cycle. Doctors making rounds, nurses changing shifts, patients healing or declining, all oblivious to the identity crisis unfolding within these four walls. "No," Patricia said, taking a step closer, her dark eyes intensely focused, as if she could extract the truth through sheer force of will. "The guy who cleans the floors doesn't perform expert CPR, doesn't assess symptoms like a trained diagnostician, doesn't interface with a crash team like he's run one before." She uncrossed her arms and placed her palms flat on the small table between them, leaning forward with the same determination she brought to difficult surgeries. "The compressions you performed were textbook perfect, better than most of my residents. Your airway management was flawless. You anticipated every step of the ACLS protocol before I could even call for it. So I'll ask you again, and I expect a real answer this time. Who are you, Marcus Evans?" The sound of his full name, rarely used in the hospital where most staff simply called him Mark, or more commonly didn't address him directly at all, triggered something in him, a recognition that this moment of reckoning had perhaps been inevitable all along. Marcus sank into one of the consultation room chairs, the weight of his dual identity suddenly too heavy to bear while standing. Through the windows, he could see the darkening sky over Manhattan, reminding him that Tyler would be waiting at after-school care, probably already wondering why his father was late. The thought of his son centered him, as it always did, providing clarity amid the confusion of this unplanned revelation. "I was a combat medic," Marcus finally admitted, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth after so many years of careful omission. 8 years with the 10th Mountain Division, including 3 tours in Afghanistan. After that, I completed accelerated paramedic training and served as a flight medic for 2 more years. He paused, measuring how much of himself to reveal. How much of his past to unearth in this sterile hospital room, so far from the dusty landscapes where he had learned to save lives under impossible conditions. I've performed more emergency procedures in field hospitals than most doctors do in their first 5 years of practice. I've intubated patients by flashlight during mortar attacks and managed mass casualties with inadequate supplies. I was good at it, very good. Patricia's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex. Professional curiosity mingled with growing respect and confusion about the disconnect between his skills and his current position. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, her white coat a stark contrast to his grey uniform in the dim light of the consultation room. "That explains the technical skills," she acknowledged, her tone softening slightly. "But it doesn't explain why someone with your background is pushing a mop at Manhattan Memorial instead of working in emergency medicine where you clearly belong. Most hospitals would hire someone with your experience in a heartbeat for a clinical position. Why hide these abilities? Why bury them under a janitor's uniform?" The question hung between them, unavoidable and penetrating. Marcus felt the carefully constructed narrative of his life being unraveled by this persistent surgeon who had witnessed a glimpse of his true self during those critical moments in the hallway. Outside, the hospital intercom called out room numbers and doctor names, the mundane soundtrack to the extraordinary conversation unfolding in this small space. He looked down at his hands that had just performed life-saving measures with expert precision, now fidgeting nervously on the table as his past and present collided with unexpected force. "My wife, Sarah, died 7 years ago," Marcus finally said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper as he approached the core of his story. "Car accident on the West Side Highway during a rainstorm. I was overseas when it happened, deployed on what I had promised would be my final tour. By the time I made it back for the funeral, Tyler, our son, had been staying with neighbors for 3 days. He was 5 years old, completely traumatized, and I was a stranger to him because I'd been gone so much of his life." The memory of Tyler's tear-stained face, regarding him with uncertainty rather than recognition at Sarah's funeral, still had the power to wound him deeply. "I made a promise at her grave that I would never leave him again, that I would be there every day, every bedtime, every school event, that I would be a father first, before anything else." The hospital cafeteria had emptied hours ago, leaving Marcus and Dr. Patricia Chen alone amid the scattered remnants of the dinner service. Half-empty coffee pots, a few abandoned trays, and the distant sound of kitchen staff preparing for tomorrow's breakfast. Patricia nursed a cooling cup of coffee, her white coat draped over the chair beside her, while Marcus glanced frequently at his phone, having already called Tyler's after-school program to explain his unprecedented lateness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces as Marcus continued the story he had kept hidden for 7 years, each word peeling away another layer of the identity he had constructed since Sarah's death. "I couldn't go back to emergency medicine or paramedic work, not with the unpredictable hours, the overnight shifts, the constant calls to trauma scenes," Marcus explained, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the Formica tabletop. "Tyler needed stability more than I needed fulfillment. He'd already lost his mother. I couldn't be an absent father too." The cafeteria's large windows reflected their images back at them, the cardiothoracic surgeon and the janitor, an unlikely pair engaged in intense conversation at this late hour. "I took the maintenance job here because it offered set hours that aligned with Tyler's school schedule, decent health insurance, and enough predictability that I could promise my son I'd be there every night to tuck him in. It wasn't about hiding my abilities. It was about prioritizing my child over my career." Patricia leaned forward, her analytical mind visibly processing this information, weighing it against what she had witnessed in the hallway earlier. "But your skills, they're extraordinary, Marcus. Do you have any idea how many lives you could save if you were working in a clinical capacity?" Her voice held no judgment, just the pragmatic assessment of a physician who recognized exceptional talent being underutilized. "Samuel Wilson is alive right now because you were there. His grandchildren still have a grandfather because you knew exactly what to do in those critical first moments. Doesn't that matter to you? Don't you miss it, being at the center of the action, using your training to its fullest potential?" The question struck a nerve that Marcus had been carefully avoiding for years, forcing him to confront the duality of his existence, the satisfaction of fulfilling his promise to Sarah and Tyler versus the undeniable emptiness of knowing his most valuable skills remained largely dormant. He gazed out at the New York skyline, the city lights twinkling against the night sky like distant stars. "Of course I miss it," he admitted, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "Every time I hear a code blue called over the intercom, every time I mop up around a trauma case and know I could have helped if I were wearing different clothes. But missing something doesn't mean you can have it, not when the cost is breaking a promise to someone who matters more than your own happiness." Patricia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful as she processed his response. "I understand the need to be there for your son. Believe me, I do. My own parents were both surgeons who were barely present for my childhood." She paused, as if debating whether to continue with the personal revelation, then pressed on. "I practically raised myself between nannies and boarding schools. I swore I'd never do that to my own children, which is partly why I don't have any yet. The demands of cardiac surgery don't leave much room for family life." Her honesty created a momentary bridge between them, two people with vastly different current circumstances, but a shared understanding of difficult choices and sacrifices. The emptiness of the cafeteria amplified the significance of their conversation, creating a liminal space where possibilities seemed more fluid than in the structured hierarchy of the hospital's daylight hours. Patricia set down her coffee cup with sudden decisiveness. "I want to offer you a position, Marcus, not as a janitor, but as a surgical assistant in the cardiac department." His surprise must have shown on his face because she continued quickly, her words gaining momentum as the idea took shape. The hours would be flexible, primarily day shifts, scheduled around Tyler's school. You'd assist in procedures, help with pre-op and post-op care, train newer staff in emergency protocols. We need someone with your level of experience and calm under pressure. Marcus felt a sudden tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with medical conditions, a constriction of hope and fear intertwining as unexpected possibilities presented themselves. "I don't have the certifications anymore," he said, though the objection sounded weak even to his own ears. "My paramedic license expired years ago. I haven't practiced medicine since before Sarah died." He was searching for practical obstacles to avoid confronting the emotional ones, the comfort of routine he had established, the safety of invisibility, the fear of returning to a world that might once again demand too much of him at his son's expense. Patricia dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand, her expression showing the confidence of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. "Certifications can be renewed, skills can be refreshed. What can't be taught is the instinct you demonstrated today, the ability to act decisively in a crisis, to remain calm when others panic, to know exactly what needs to be done to save a life." She leaned across the table, her gaze intense and unwavering. "The hospital would sponsor your recertification. We could structure your schedule around Tyler's needs. You wouldn't have to choose between being a good father and using your gifts, Marcus. You could do both." The possibility hung in the air between them, tantalizing and frightening in equal measure. Through the cafeteria windows, Marcus could see his reflection, still in the grey janitor's uniform that had defined him for 7 years, but with something new in his expression, a spark of the man he had once been, before grief and responsibility had narrowed his existence. He thought of Tyler, now old enough to understand sacrifice, to ask questions about why his father cleaned floors when he had once saved lives. He thought of Sarah, wondering if her wish for him to be present for their son had ever meant he should deny such essential parts of himself. "I would need guarantees about the hours," Marcus said finally, the words feeling like stepping off a precipice into unknown territory. No overnight shifts unless absolutely unavoidable, no last-minute schedule changes that would leave Tyler alone. He comes first, always. The conditions were firm, non-negotiable, the boundaries he needed to ensure he kept his most important promise while potentially reclaiming a part of himself he had thought lost forever. And I would need time to talk to Tyler, to make sure he understands what this would mean for both of us. This isn't just my decision. It affects him, too. The autumn sun filtered through the leaves of Central Park, casting dappled shadows across the bench where Marcus sat with Tyler, both of them holding ice cream cones despite the slight chill in the October air. 2 weeks had passed since the incident with Samuel Wilson, 2 weeks of careful conversations, administrative meetings, paperwork, and soul-searching that had culminated in this moment of truth between father and son. Tyler, at 12, had his mother's thoughtful brown eyes and analytical mind, attributes that made him both perceptive and occasionally challenging as he navigated the complicated transition from child to adolescent. Marcus watched his son's profile as he considered how to begin the conversation that would potentially reshape both their lives. "Remember when you asked me why I'm just a janitor at the hospital?" Marcus finally said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. The question hung in the crisp air as nearby joggers passed and distant children's laughter floated from the playground. Tyler's expression shifted from contentment to curiosity, clearly surprised that his father had brought up a topic that had seemed closed after their initial discussion. "Yeah," he responded cautiously, taking another lick of his rapidly melting chocolate ice cream. "You said it was because you needed a job with regular hours so you could be home with me. Was that not true?" Marcus felt a pang of guilt at the hint of uncertainty in his son's voice, the subtle fear of discovering dishonesty from the parent he trusted implicitly. "It was absolutely true," he assured Tyler quickly, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, "but it wasn't the whole truth." The park around them continued its weekend rhythms, families picnicking on blankets, artists sketching by the lake, tourists consulting maps and taking photos, all oblivious to the pivotal conversation unfolding on this ordinary bench. "Before you were born, before I met your mom even, I was a combat medic in the army. I saved lives in very dangerous places. After the military, I worked as a paramedic on helicopter rescue missions. That's actually how I met your mom. She was a flight dispatcher for the service I worked for." Tyler's eyes widened with surprise, his ice cream temporarily forgotten as he processed this new information about his father's past. "You were like a doctor in the army, and you flew in helicopters saving people." The admiration in his voice was unmistakable, tinged with confusion about how this impressive history connected to the father he knew, the man who checked his homework, made his lunches, and cleaned hospital floors. "Why didn't you ever tell me? That's so cool, Dad." The simple, unfiltered reaction of a 12-year-old boy learning his father had a secret heroic past brought an unexpected lump to Marcus's throat. "I guess I didn't talk about it because after your mom died, I had to make choices," Marcus explained, choosing his words carefully to ensure Tyler understood the reasoning without feeling burdened by it. Being a medic or a paramedic means unpredictable hours, emergency calls in the middle of the night, sometimes being gone for days during disasters. When it was just you and me, I needed to be reliable. Someone you could count on to be there every day, not rushing off to emergencies. The memory of Sarah's funeral flashed again in his mind, Tyler clinging to their neighbor's hand because Marcus had been a virtual stranger after his long deployment. So I took a job that would let me be the dad you needed, even if it meant not using the medical skills I had. A squirrel darted past their bench, momentarily diverting Tyler's attention before he returned his thoughtful gaze to Marcus. "But something changed, right?" he asked perceptively, always quick to catch the underlying currents in adult conversations. "That's why we're talking about this now." The directness of the question, so characteristic of his son's approach to life, made Marcus smile, despite the seriousness of their discussion. He nodded, taking a deep breath as he prepared to explain the opportunity that Dr. Patricia Chen had offered, and what it might mean for their carefully structured life together. 2 weeks ago, a man had a heart attack in the hallway at the hospital, right in front of me, Marcus began, watching Tyler's expression carefully as he shared the story he had been waiting to tell. Nobody else knew what to do, so I stepped in and performed CPR until the doctors arrived. I helped save his life. He paused, allowing the significance to register with his son. The head cardiac surgeon, Dr. Chen, saw what I did, saw that I had training and skills that could help more people if I wasn't just cleaning floors. She's offered me a new position at the hospital as a surgical assistant in the cardiac department. I'd be helping during operations, training staff in emergency procedures using my medical knowledge again. Tyler was silent for several moments, processing this information with the careful consideration that sometimes made him seem older than his 12 years. Around them, the park continued its weekend rhythms, the world unchanged while their private universe shifted on its axis. "Would you still be home for dinner?" he finally asked, the question revealing his most immediate concern. "Would you still come to my science fair next month?" The simplicity of the questions brought both relief and a renewed sense of responsibility to Marcus. His son wasn't opposed to the change, just concerned about maintaining the security they had built together. "That's the first thing I made sure of," Marcus assured him, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "The hours would be regular day shifts, mostly while you're at school. I'd still pick you up most days, still be home for dinner, still come to every school event. There might be rare emergencies where I'd have to stay late, but Dr. Chen understands that you're my priority." He hesitated, then added the most important part. "But I wanted to talk to you before I gave her my final answer. This affects both of us, Tyler. Your opinion matters to me. If you're not comfortable with this change, we can keep things exactly as they are." Tyler finished the last of his ice cream cone, wiping his hands on a napkin as he appeared to carefully weigh the situation. The dappled sunlight shifted across his face as clouds moved overhead, momentarily shadowing his thoughtful expression. "Mom would want you to do it," he said finally, with a certainty that startled Marcus. "You always tell me stories about how she was the bravest person you knew, how she always told people to use their talents to help others." Tyler turned to face his father directly, his young face serious. "I think she'd be mad if she knew you were cleaning floors when you could be saving people like that man in the hospital." The unexpected invocation of Sarah's memory and values from their son's perspective brought tears to Marcus's eyes that he quickly blinked away. "You think so?" he asked softly, hearing the slight catch in his own voice. The idea that Tyler could understand and articulate his mother's values, despite having lost her so young, was both painful and deeply moving. The boy nodded, with the conviction that only children can muster, free from the complications and second-guessing that plague adult decision-making. "Besides," Tyler continued with practical reasoning, "it would be pretty cool to tell my friends my dad helps with heart surgeries instead of just saying he's a janitor." A hint of the pre-teen's emerging social consciousness revealed itself in this candid admission, making Marcus smile despite the seriousness of their conversation. "And maybe you could help me with my science homework better. We're starting human biology next semester." The simple, pragmatic observations grounded their discussion, bringing it from the realm of life-altering decisions back to the everyday concerns that defined their relationship. As they sat together on the park bench, the future suddenly seemed to crystallize before Marcus. Not a betrayal of his promise to Sarah, as he had feared for so many years, but an evolution of it. Being there for Tyler had never meant denying his own skills and purpose. It had meant ensuring his son's needs were met while finding a sustainable way forward for both of them. Dr. Chen's offer represented not a choice between his identity as a healer and his role as a father, but a reconciliation of these essential parts of himself that had seemed irreconcilable in the fog of grief and sudden single parenthood. "So, you're okay with it if I take the new position?" Marcus asked, wanting absolute clarity before making his final decision. "You know, it might mean some changes for us. Maybe a few evenings when Mrs. Abernathy next door has to pick you up if there's an emergency at the hospital." He needed Tyler to understand the potential disruptions, however minor, that might accompany this shift in their carefully structured routine. The boy considered this for a moment, then nodded with surprising maturity. "Dad, you've been taking care of just me for 7 years, Tyler said, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. "Maybe it's time you get to help other people too." He stood up from the bench, stretching in the autumn sunlight, as if physically embracing the change they were discussing. "Plus, now when you tell me to clean my room, I can't say you're just saying that because you're a janitor." The cheeky grin that accompanied this observation was pure Tyler, finding humor even in moments of significance, a resilience inherited from both his parents. As they walked through Central Park toward home, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years, as if the weight of divided identity he had carried since Sarah's death had finally begun to lift. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Chen to accept her offer, beginning the process of recertification and training that would allow him to step back into a world he had thought forever closed to him. But tonight, he would help Tyler with his science presentation, read another chapter of the adventure novel they were working through, and tuck his son into bed, the unchanging rhythm of fatherhood that would remain his constant priority even as other aspects of his life transformed. The path ahead would require careful navigation, adjustments for both of them as they incorporated this new dimension into their relationship. Yet as Tyler skipped ahead to chase another squirrel, then turned back to wait for his father with an impatient wave, Marcus felt a certainty that had eluded him since Sarah's death. The janitor, who had stopped a code blue, was becoming whole again, not by leaving his responsibilities behind, but by finding a way to honor all parts of himself, healer and father, protector and provider, roles that strengthened rather than diminished each other when held in proper balance.